So my name is William Webster. I'm the moderator this morning. I am an ex-director of CRISP, the Centre for Research into Information Surveillance and Privacy. CRISP has a long-standing relationship with CPDP. We've been coming for over a decade, and we've done various panels in that period on things like smart cities, live face recognition, living in surveillance societies, and we're going to look at employee monitoring this morning. Now, CRISP is a networked research centre. It's spread across 5 British universities: University of St Andrews, University of Edinburgh, University of Stirling, University of Southampton and Manchester. Lots of different research projects across those institutions on lots of different elements of surveillance and privacy. What we do specifically, and the reason why we come to CPDP, is we have a very strong social science component, and we bring a lot of social science ideas to CPDP. And this particular panel is the Rosamund van Broekel inaugural panel, which is a great honour for Rosamund because she was involved in setting up CPDP many years ago, heavily involved in creation of what we see today. And she is a social scientist, and they have honoured her by creating a panel in her name, which we are delighted to host this year as CRISP. So Rosamund isn't here, so I can't acknowledge her, but she will be knocking around somewhere at the conference. Okay, so as moderator, my main task is to make sure that this panel runs to time, make sure that you all get an opportunity to ask your questions. So the speakers are going to speak for about 10 minutes. The Q&A can come after all the speakers have spoken. Hopefully there'll be lots of time for discussion and all the questions that you might ask. Can I ask that if you want to ask a question that you raise your hand, and can I ask that you say which institution you are affiliated with when you ask a question, just so they have a sense of where you're coming from. And yes, hopefully we're all set up and ready to go. Hopefully it will run smoothly. The final thing I should say is a few words about our topic this morning. So as you can see from the screen, our topic is data protection and digital monitoring in the workplace. I need to take my glasses off for this bit. Middle age. Okay, so the line of argument that we're bringing forward this morning is that digital employee monitoring has intensified in Europe in recent years and has known employee health, safety and work well-being concerns. There is also a considerable variation in the application of GDPR in workplaces across the EU, and this affects the way that digital monitoring is governed in practice. So some countries prohibit all but basic time and attendance monitoring. Other countries permit employees to have greater autonomy to watch and monitor their employees more intimately. So this panel is aiming to explore those differences. And we're looking at how data protection can be used to promote healthy, safe and equitable working conditions where employees are digitally monitored. So we have an excellent set of speakers here. I'm going to just introduce them, but if they want to say more about themselves and their own institutions, I'll let them do that in their 10-minute slot. So Professor Kirsty Ball, CRISP Director from the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Christina Vanini-Goodchild, a data protection consultant from CVG Solutions. Emmanuel Brun, a project manager at the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work. And David Villani, part of the employment team at the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission. So that's enough of me. I'm going to pass you straight on to David, and we have slides ready to go.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you, William, and thank you also to Christy for putting this together. I don't have much time, but what I'm going to do today is basically to present a little bit, to give an overview of the AIM-Work survey, which is survey that together with my colleagues at the employment team we have developed in the last years. Now we finished the data collection, and there are already preliminary results that are out. Basically, this is a representative survey of the European working population. We've got about 70,000 observations. It maps the use of digital devices, digital monitoring, and algorithmic management at the workplace. And of course, it also matches this information with a set of variables on working conditions. I think that there is not much time, but I would like to differentiate between what we define as digital monitoring versus algorithmic management, because while digital monitoring only in our framework regards the collection of data, while while algorithmic management also involves the use of those data to direct and give orders, so to speak, to the workers. So what I'm going to speak today is only the digital monitoring part, because per se, we believe that it has some value and it has impact on working conditions, basically. One interesting thing of the survey is that we don't collect only one of few indicators of practices of digital monitoring. We have 10 of them, which you can see there in the table, which basically include time monitoring, the computer monitoring, calls or emails, CCTVs, internet monitoring, track cards, sensors, vehicle monitoring, and social media monitoring, okay? So this allows us to have a sort of heterogeneous and diversified view of what's going on in Europe. Overall, what we observe is that about 1/4 of European employees, here I'm referring only to employees, are not digitally monitored, and the remaining 75% have at least one type of digital monitoring. About 1/3 of the workers are subject only to one type of digital monitoring, and the remaining 40% have two or more type of digital monitoring they're subject to. Of course, the prevalence of the practices changes a lot. We see that the most common ones are time and track cards as forms of digital monitoring, which cover about 35% of the overall workforce. While we have other technologies such as computer, internet, CCTVs that ranges are between 10 and 15%, and few residual ones, especially track sensors, which cover 4 or 5% of the workforce. Of course, the way these technologies and practices are employed changes, and we believe it's important to see how they cluster together. Here I present the results of a simple clustering analysis, and we can see that out of the 10 practices that we presented before, we can collect them into 3 main blocks. The first one has to do with physical monitoring, how people move at the workplace, and this includes CCTV, tracking sensors, and vehicles. The second cluster has to do with activity monitoring, basically office monitoring, which includes computer, emails, internet, and social media monitoring. And the third one is the broader one, which includes time and track cards, okay? So this is basically how the 10 initial practices group together and tend to go together at the workplaces. Now, of course, the prevalence of these practices changes considerably across occupations. Here, the first thing I want to highlight is that overall, the prevalence is relatively high or similar across all occupations. What we see in the first column of this table is that only agricultural and elementary occupations have a relatively low exposure to digital monitoring, while all the other occupations have a relatively similar and higher exposure to digital monitoring practices, on an average of 1.3, 1.4 practices per occupation. In this picture, we also see that operators stand out as the occupation where digital monitoring is more prevalent. Of course, the type of digital monitoring changes between occupations. And we see that physical monitoring is more prevalent in trades and operators. The numbers here is basically how above or below the means you are exposed to a certain technology. So if it's positive, it means you are more exposed. If the value is negative, it means you are less exposed to that practice. We see that physical monitoring is more prevalent in trades and operators, while activity monitoring is more common, understandably, among office workers, that is, managers, professional technicians, and clerks, to some extent, which are not office workers, but still. Well, we see that time monitoring also is quite transversal, as we were seeing before. We don't see a clear prevalence in any of these practices. So this is to say that there is a large variety in the way these practices distribute across occupations. Before I finish, I also would like to mention some country and regional heterogeneity. The map here of Europe shows a clear divide between, on the one hand, Eastern European countries, which have the highest intensity in terms of digital monitoring, and the rest of the countries in Europe, which have considerably lower exposure. In the rest of the countries, we can also classify two main blocks, where in the first one, which is sort of in the middle, we find France, Belgium, and Southern European countries, and Ireland. And then we have a third block, which is countries where digital monitoring is less prevalent, is less diffused. And here we find Germany, Denmark, and Sweden and Finland. Okay? Obviously, these differences partly reflect sectoral specialization of the economies, but I want to stress this, there is no time to show it now, but I want to stress that this is not the main element that explains these country differences, okay? These country differences persist and are there even when we control for sectoral specialization of the economy. Just to give you a little bit more detail of what this difference means, in the bottom of this slide, I put a table where you can see for some practices, the top countries in terms of usage and the bottom 5 countries in terms of usage. And what I want to highlight is the huge differences that there are across countries. So for example, for CCTVs, you see that there are some countries that are above 40% of the workforce that are subject to CCTVs, while other countries like Germany and Austria only have 4% of the workforce exposed to CCTVs. So it's a tenfold difference between countries, which is huge. For other technologies, the difference is not that high, but my main point here is that we do see a lot of variation across countries. So, to conclude, digital monitoring includes a wide range of practices, and I think it's important that we account for that because, no time to show this here, but the effects on working conditions change depending on the practice we analyze. Second point is that digital monitoring is very common across the EU, okay? Because as we have seen, most of the workers are subject to some extent to some practices of digital monitoring. However, there are many specifications that we need to add. The first one is that there are large differences in technologies used. It's not the same to just say digital monitoring. We have a lot of different practices with a lot of different diffusions across countries. The second point is that there is a huge difference between occupations, sectors, and countries, as we have just seen. And the last point I would like to mention is that, and this probably is the most interesting part for discussion, is that the role of the institution, labor relation regulation, what we see is central in the way digital monitoring is deployed and also on the effect that it has on working conditions of workers. And I will stop here.
Thank you. Just pass the back to what we want.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair. Well, building upon, I have to move the slides, yes. Okay. Building upon what David just presented, I'm going to give you some data about a survey that our agency, the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work, which is, by the way, a tripartite agency of the European Union, in charge of collecting, analyzing, and disseminating information related to occupational safety and health at work. So our agency has run a survey of workers as well in the EU about occupational safety and health at work, and we have included some questions there about the use of digital technologies in the workplace. And as you can see on these slides, when workers reported that digital technologies are used in their workplace, you can see the purposes for using this digital technology in the workplace. So it's about allocating time or tasks, about monitoring performance, behavior, about giving instructions to workers about how to do their work. And what I want to emphasize here is that it all builds upon a large data collection digital collection of workers and, in fact, collection of a large amount of data about workers to be able to support these purposes through digital monitoring and algorithmic management in the workplace. So then we looked at what is the impact on the perceived impact on workers of these technologies being used in their workplaces for the purpose I just mentioned. And as you see here, there is prevalence of what we call psychosocial risks being reported by workers where these technologies are used in their workplaces for these purposes. So mainly it's about poor job control in terms of speed of work, in terms of intensity of work. It's also about poorer interaction with their peers, about high workloads. And all of these are known psychosocial risks in the workplace, resulting in stress, anxiety, etc. So what is the important message here is that these technologies that monitor and collect and use digitally collected data in the workplace have a negative impact on workers' mental health. And here, this slide looks very complicated, but the key message is simple. It's findings from another survey that our agency runs, and this time it's a survey of establishments. So I thought it's important to show you that both from the worker side as well as from the responsible in establishment side, we see a similar pattern whereby digital technologies, when they are used in the workplace, again for purposes of monitoring workers' behavior or performance, of allocating tasks, shifts, etc., you see that where they are present, so the row where you see present for each of these technologies listed on the left is longer, so meaning that there are the probability of reporting psychosocial risks is higher than where they are not present. So the psychosocial risks that were measured here, let's say, were time pressure, communication with peers, job insecurity, so the fear of job loss, and long working hours. So quite interesting to see a similar pattern between what workers and employers report. So in a nutshell, not only from our surveys, but also from other research methods that we've implemented, like literature reviews, case study research, and so on. You see here on the left-hand side of the slide, the main psychosocial risks, so stress factors, where there is evidence that they are associated with the use of digital technologies, monitoring and managing workers. So as you could see in the survey results, it's all related to the constant monitoring of workers' data, resulting in higher work intensity, performance pressure, the fact that workers interact less with their peers, so lower social support. But here you see some points that that were not covered in our survey, and it's lack of transparency. So it's all about the way the data are collected, the information that is shared with workers about what data are being collected, for what purpose, who has access to this, and about the decision-making process and the perceived or real unfairness of the process. So this lack of transparency, this information imbalance, impede an aspect which is key to the prevention of workers' safety and health risks, which is worker participation. If you have a lack of information, an imbalance of information power, let's say, this affects the workers' right to be consulted and the obligation of employers to consult and involve properly their workers in the decision being made about the introduction of new technologies in the workplace. So just to emphasize how much data protection is a key aspect that within the area of safety and health at work is really important to highlight. I also mentioned some opportunities. It's clear if these technologies are properly implemented, managed in consultation with their workers, they have the potential to be used for the good purpose, let's say, so to allocate tasks and workloads in a way that is adapted to the individuals rather than putting pressure on the individual. But what we see in reality is that it's rather, let's say, rare at the moment that such digital monitoring and management technologies are indeed introduced in the workplace for the purpose of improving worker safety and health. It's rather about optimizing productivity. From another research method that we are also using, which is case study research, so where we go into the practice of workplaces and we look at management practices, prevention practices, worker consultation, training, etc. I will briefly mention two case studies that we've done in the automotive sector to show you how two very different approaches have very different consequences on workers' safety and health and mental health in particular. So this first case, to sum up, algorithmic management technologies were introduced in the workplace in a very participatory way, involving workers in all the decisions already at the preliminary stage of choosing the digital monitoring systems that would be implemented, what kind of data would be collected, for what purpose, etc. And in a nutshell, the result of the introduction of this system was that workers felt they were more or better supported in their work because they felt they had the information that they needed to be able to adjust the way they were working. And again, in a nutshell, as a summary, we could see that job satisfaction was improved, that stress levels were reduced, and overall, there were positive outcomes in terms of occupational safety and health. In the second case study that I'm showing here, the process of introduction of the technologies was quite different. It was a much larger enterprise, by the way, and the decision was much more based on a top-down approach. So workers were not consulted on how these technologies would be implemented and used. It was very much imposed, let's say, with the purpose of improving productivity and reducing incidents in terms of quality of production. So here, although we could see a reduction of number in the quality in the incidence of quality, and a better ergonomic situation, let's say, in terms of mental health, the panorama was quite different. There was a high turnover of workers, most of them being temporary agency workers with a very high turnover and very high work intensity. So this was to reinforce the message that depending on how digital monitoring technologies are introduced, depending on how all the aspects around data protection are being implemented in proper consultation with workers, it has a very different impact on worker safety and health. From the legislation point of view, in the EU, we have a very powerful piece of legislation in the area of occupational safety and health at work, which is the framework, so-called Framework Directive from 1988. And this Framework Directive introduces the obligation on employers, among others, to consult their workers on the introduction of new technologies and to assess all kinds of risks that may impact on worker safety and health in the workplace. So it means that this directive also applies to the risks of digital technologies, monitoring technologies, algorithmic management technologies introduced in the workplace. So this directive is a powerful tool to require to the employers to take into consideration these processes to minimize the risks, and we saw that there are some risks on workers' mental health, and to consult, inform properly their workers, also on the data collection, monitoring, and use process to minimize these risks. Of course, the OSH Framework Directive operates alongside other important pieces of legislation in the EU, the AI Act, the General Data Protection Regulation, which you might know better than me, because I'm an OSH expert, but all of them are very important to address together the aspects related to data protection and digital monitoring. Oh, sorry, I went back. I'm coming to my conclusions. So this speech here, the key message is that it is very important when introducing digital monitoring and algorithmic management technologies in the process, in the workplace, to make sure that humans remain in command, that workers' autonomy and job control is preserved, and a key aspect of that is transparency of information collection and information processing. If a low importance is paid to these aspects in the workplace, it will have negative impacts on worker safety and health, in particular mental health, and that the proper cooperation between data protection actors and occupational safety and health actors is key to properly protect workers' safety and health. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about data protection. So I'm going to bring what Davide and Emmanuel have been saying into the data protection world. And I'm going to do that by concentrating on two things. The first thing I'm going to say is I'm going to actually look into some of the national schemes that Emmanuel referred to and make the point that actually data protection is one common thread which runs through all forms of national regulation on electronic monitoring where it exists. And the other thing I'm going to do is take you through, in some detail, 50 years of research onto electronic monitoring. That's mostly computer-based monitoring. And what you'll see in that research is that data protection is there in the variables and in the findings, but it wasn't actually designed in because the people who did that research were occupational psychologists, organizational psychologists, work sociologists, but you can see the importance of data protection in practice in promoting fair and legal work monitoring. So that's what I'm going to talk about. But before I do that, I'm going to start my timer so I know that I'm on time. Okay, right, good, let's go. So essentially, we should all know these. We should all know the common foundations of data protection. And when you start looking at national regulations, you see these kind of imported into the patchwork of regulation that covers workplace monitoring in member states. There is also a really interesting piece of case law, if you don't know, and the case is Barbulescu, and I apologise for my pronunciation, that's probably not right. Barbulescu versus Romania, and that case was heard in the European Court for Human Rights. What happened in that case was that there was an employee who used excessively used company systems to send instant messages to family and friends, and the company was monitoring them covertly and fired them for breaching the IT policy. Now, the employee took the employee to court and said, that's an invasion of my privacy, that wasn't fair, and the Romanian courts found in favour of the employer. The employee then appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Court of Human Rights found in favour of the employee because they said that Romanian courts hadn't sufficiently applied the balancing test between all of the competing interests in the application of this covert surveillance. So as well as this kind of patchwork of regulation nationally, you also get emerging case law around the use of covert surveillance in particular in the workplace. So that's the kind of common picture. When you start looking at national differences, I've looked at 3 different countries. I've looked at Spain, Germany, and the UK, largely because that's where I'm from, and there is actually quite a unique approach in the UK. But regulation tends to be a patchwork, and what you find is a patchwork of data protection law, a patchwork of labour law, and in the UK case, a patchwork of national security law. But when you compare the laws in Spain and Germany in this patchwork, what you also get are very different starting points, and this is the institutional picture that Davide was referring to. So in the German picture, you get a very restrictive approach. So the national approach is vary in terms of their permissibility. And you get a very restrictive approach in Germany whereby phone and email monitoring are considered unlawful because you can't monitor private conversations, but with consent and with restrictive purposes, you can use it in the workplace. German organisations are really advised to outlaw all personal use of email in the workplace to kind of get around this. CCTV is used for very restrictive purposes, biometrics is considered disproportionate, and device monitoring, again, very restrictive purposes because of the danger of function creep. So, and when you compare that to Spain, you have a very different starting point. In Spain, we have a starting point that says, well, the employer can use technologies such as CCTV, phone and device monitoring to check that the employee is fulfilling duties, and then from there you start applying the safeguards. Email is very restricted, and biometrics, there's just no provisions in Spain at all. So you have similar legislative frameworks, similar patchworks, but very different starting points. And then when you look at the UK has no labour law at all in its regulatory patchwork for electronic monitoring. That's because in the European setting, it's around works councils and consultation with works councils, and that's not a thing in the UK. But what you do have in the UK is very, very specific guidance. So you have Investigatory Powers Act, which allows sometimes organisations can be mandated to give data for national security purposes. That features. The ICO has also developed some very specific guidelines on how you apply the GDPR in monitoring, in things like bring your own device, in things like recruitment, very specific guidance for employers. And also we have sector guidance in the UK. So sector guidance is relating to financial services and call recording for compliance purposes. And also in the public sector, there's specific rules on CCTV, which I believe William looks after now. Can I just ask, are there any Brits in the room working with the guidance? A little bit with the guidance. Okay, cool. I might want to talk to you after, if that's okay. Right. So that's essentially a bit of a landscape there in terms of the national differences. But so what? What I want to emphasise is to the audience here, primarily interested in data protection, is that when it comes to employee monitoring, data protection is the common thread. And also, the research, 50 years of research, tells us that phenomena allied to data protection can make a real difference to how employees feel about surveillance and workplace monitoring. And I will just show you how that works in this diagram. So what I'm about to show you is a map of the research findings. It's not a model, it's not something causal, but this tells you exactly how the variables fit together and how the kind of connections are made over a 50-year period of research. And so when we consider the impacts of monitoring in the workplace, the first thing that you observe, if there's a problem, is your employees telling you, well, this feels intrusive, this is gathering too much information. This feels authoritarian, so it's been applied in a draconian way. Or this feels excessive, so it's the purpose is being exceeded. And when those things arise for employees, really reflecting what Emmanuel said, you have a number of consequences that arise for the psychology side of the workplace and also the social side of the workplace. As I said, these research findings have been generated by academics, by business academics working in the psychology and sociology of work. So when you get these intrusive feelings, well, we see changes in attitudes and behaviours. We see an impact on senses of fairness and justice in the workplace, senses of job satisfaction. We see an impact on creativity, and because there's a chilling effect related to it, commitment to work, autonomy, trust, and all sorts of things like that. And of course, stress goes up. But we also see impact on social relationships in the workplace. We see a disruption in social relationships. And we see a rise in two phenomena. One is called emotional labour, and the other one is called identity work. And if you imagine what these are, if you are doing emotional labour and identity work, you're being very sure that what you are projecting outwardly into the workplace in terms of your emotion and your identity and how other people see you, and crucially how technology sees you, and there's a big gap between that and how you feel inside, that's emotional labour and identity work. And the bigger the gap, the worse it is for the person. We also have a prevalence of control-based organisational values can emerge, as well as resistance. Now, there's a truism about workplace surveillance, and that is that the more draconian you go, you're more likely to provoke the behaviours that you put the surveillance in to prevent. So it can be really counterproductive and produce resistance, which is not just quitting or strike action. There's all sorts of sabotage that can go on in between. But then when you look at the causes of these feelings, we go back to the middle of the diagram, going to the left-hand side now, what you see is phenomena which reflect data protection law and practices and principles. So we see that the content and process of monitoring really influences how people feel about it, what they're collecting data about, whether disproportionate amounts of data are being collected, whether monitoring data represents performance accurately, or whether employees can control aspects of it. The research also finds that purpose has a role to play. Well, this is absolutely core to data protection. If there is no purpose to monitoring, then people are really going to question why it's there, if it's been clearly explained or if it's been exceeded. And finally, whether there's policy and practice in place to support monitoring. So is there a policy? Has it been properly explained? Do people know their rights under it? And crucially, what Emmanuel referred to, is there a socially supportive management style to actually counteract some of the stressful effects of monitoring? So when you reflect on this, you start to see data protection, you start to see accuracy, transparency, accountability, proportionality, purpose limitation. So our message really is that if you are working in data protection with monitored employees, by creating connections with people who manage employees, such as HR managers or line managers, and increasing the knowledge of data protection, this can really make a difference to outcomes in the workplace. And now I'm going to pass over to Christina, who is going to tell you a little bit more about this. There you are.
Thank you. Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Christina. I'm the director of CVG Solution, and I'm based in the UK. So I have been asked to talk to you about what value does data protection professionals bring to this subject, to the monitoring and tracking in the workplace. So as a data protection professional, I have observed two trends of organizations type that, it's introducing monitoring and tracking in the workplace. The first one is the one that I refer to as a positive culture. So this kind of organization tends to be very energetic, very young at heart, very forward-looking, and very enthusiastic about, a new shiny tool. Oh, yes, let's bring it in, without giving it too much thought to the data that the tool is collecting, how it's being used, and the impact that this is having to the workforce. The second type of culture is what I call the negative culture, also referred as controlling culture. So in this type of organization, there is a lack of trust between the employer and the employee. And the rise in the remote working has increased, from the organizational point of view, a feeling of losing control over their employees. And so the monitoring, tracking, and also the more intensities, the more it gives them the feeling that they're getting back that control. So, but whenever, an organization is, introducing monitoring tracking, there are certain factors that needs to be taken into consideration, some of which have already been touched upon by Kirsty. The first one is, the purpose. What is it that we are trying to achieve as an organization? What is the aim that we want to get to? And what are the benefits to the organization, but also to the employees that should be looked at? And is it really necessary? Can we do the same thing in a way that it's less intrusive? So really they should be looking at that. Proportionality is key. Is the data that the tool is collecting proportionate to the purpose, or are we collecting more than we should? And also, how are we going to govern that the data collected is not going to be used for a secondary purpose that is not aligned to the original purpose? So that needs to be in place even before you launch anything. Transparency and fairness are also key. Now, transparency, comes through via communication. But communication is not an email to your employees at the 11th hour. They sort of say, oh, by the way, on Wednesday, a new tool is going to be uploaded on your machine, which, by the way, is going to track, how many keys you're typing on your keyboard. That's not communication, that's telling, all right? So communication is a two-way stream. It needs to, start from the very beginning to all the way through. Fairness, I could have been spending the entire day, typing, updating my CVs and applying for jobs. So the results would be, Christina's been very productive today, when actually I've done everything but being productive. So that is a false positive. While instead of colleague could have been working really hard in meetings, brainstorming, being very creative, talking to colleagues, creating a new product and typing very little. So the results would be, a false negative. So that's not fair, right? So that's also need to be taken into consideration. Lawfulness, there is a tendency to use consent as a lawful basis, as a way to go to, but in an employer-employee environment, consent is not valid due to the power imbalance, okay? Because it does not have an environment that creates a freely given consent. And so a legitimate interest would be more appropriate. However, this is where the employer then has the responsibility to prove through the balance test that the organization interests do not overrun the rights and freedom of the individual. Now, if the monitoring tracking tool is quite intrusive, they're going to find it really hard to prove, okay? So they've got to think about that. And then security and data transfer. So what security features does the tool have? Do we need to think of additional security features to introduce? What about organizational measures? And access right? Who's got access to that data? And is the access rights based on the principle of least privileged? Is the data being transferred, for storage outside of your territory? And if so, in which country is it going to? And what, legal safeguards do you need to put in place for that? So that needs to be, and also is the provider of the software one of the big guys, and you're quite small, so you have again that power imbalance where you've got very little say on how it's structured and how it's sorted. So that needs to be taken into consideration. Now, I think so. Data protection professional, they bring a variety of golden nuggets. That's what I call them, okay? Because we come from all different backgrounds. And so not only we bring the GDPR knowledge and experience of its applicability in an organization, but also we bring with us the knowledge and experience from other disciplines. So in a previous life, as head of transformation for a global organization, implementing change, which is what introducing a tool would be, was a quite frequent occurrence. And so we used the 3 C's methodology. Has anybody heard of it? No? Okay. So the first step is communication. Okay. The second step is communication. Can anybody guess what the third step is? You've got it, okay? Communication, okay? So, but as I said, communication is a two-way stream, and it starts at the very beginning of the conception stage, all the way through implementation, and then beyond, okay? So that's really, really important. But also be open. As I said, it's a two-way stream. It's not just top-down, it's also bottom-up. Be open to feedback. The DPIA guidelines, so the Protection Impact Assessment Guideline, recommends that you should consult the data subject, the individual, when you're implementing something. I cannot think of any more appropriate scenario of consulting with your employees when you're introducing something as monitoring and tracking, especially if it is invasive, okay? And be open to their feedback, because there's nothing better to that. Now, for an effective I'm pressing the wrong button. So for an effective communication, the communication needs to have certain elements within it. The first element is the why. So you really need to tell them why you're doing this. What are the benefits to the organization and to them? What are the consequences if you don't implement this? Okay. And again, really be open. And what's the purpose? So going back to the purpose that I talked earlier. The second element is the what. What exactly does this change entail? Okay, and what does it mean to their role? What impact is going to have to their role? What kind of what process? What change do they need to implement to their process, to their daily routine, so that they can get to understand it? Be open, be honest, be open to feedback. Okay, and consult. Also, don't paint, a rosy picture. You need to balance the positive with the negative, because otherwise they're not going to believe you. Okay, so you need to be realistic. The third element is the when, is the how. Is how are you going to implement this, in details? What role do they play in it, if so, and tell them what that is. Ask for volunteers, because otherwise it feels like it's been done to them, rather than, bring them on board with you. Because if they understand the purpose, then you're less likely to have resistance, to have that, lack of or reduce of trust, reduce of morale in the workplace. So these are all elements of how to help you. And then the fourth element is the when. So let them know, the high-level timeline of the project, and so that they can start preparing mentally and emotionally for it. Provide them with the immediate next steps, so they know when it's coming, what to expect. But again, consult. That is the best advice that I can give. Is really, really bring them on board to maybe not to eliminate, but to reduce some of the social issues that my colleagues have already sort of covered. Now, finally, this is just my contact details. If any of you wish to continue the discussion in days to come, or simply wants to connect. So thank you very much.
Well done.
Okay, so we're now at the Q&A discussion part. We do have a roving mic for questions, so our panellists, perfectly formed set of presentations there, feeding from one to another. Who has any questions or comments for our panellists?
Hi, I'm Michael Veal from UCL. I'm wondering reflections on the Platform Work Directive and how some of the data protection obligations in that that are different from data protection law might be made more horizontal. So, for example, the Platform Work Directive has different kinds of dialogue with users and with groups of users, and particularly has the ability for groups of employees and workers, people performing platform work, to pay an external expert to scrutinize some of these systems. And if that kind of approach, which is now present in EU data protection law, might have some validity, were the Commission to propose a horizontal data protection law, lex specialis on workplace monitoring, which has been mooted several times.
Who wants to respond to that? Okay. I'll give a very brief response to that, because I'm not super familiar with the Platform Work Directive, but I am familiar with the experience of platform workers and the fact that people who are in those kind of roles don't have a whole lot of negotiating power, and so there's going to be there'll have to be some form of organising. And I work with a colleague who runs a SCIO, it's a Scottish charity, SCIO, called the Workers' Observatory, and they actually are building data competency and algorithmic literacy among delivery riders in order to kind of build them up for this kind of activity. But I think there's a big gap between what the legislation perhaps, or the directive is perhaps suggesting may happen, and the likelihood of that happening, simply because of the difficult situation that many platform workers find themselves in out of necessity. However, there is definitely impetus to organise, as we have seen through the delivery strikes and the independent workers of the world and all those types of organisations bringing platform workers together. And of course, they also gain the system as well, in a way. So yeah, I that's my concern. But I think it's a good point that you're making. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else want to add anything there?
There's a question there. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Clément Barbier. I work at the French rail company, and I had some issue with the digital monitoring of coworkers. And I was wondering if you think that the main issue with digital monitoring is taking the human out of it, the emotions out of it, because I feel like some managers and some companies want to monitor with, handle the company with numbers more than really emotions and humans, and they want to know if their ROI is going up, if they're making more money, and just really organizing the company around numbers while it's human working within it, and feelings and issues with family issues and stuff like that. So in short, do you believe that the issue with digital monitoring is the desire to go with numbers instead of humans?
I can reply something.
Yeah,
you can complement. For sure, it's a very important aspect. That's why at policy level and regulation level, there is always this human in command aspect, which is reinforced, because it's really important to have the human in centers. And in my presentation, I mentioned that in many cases, the way these technologies are introduced links to a reduction of interaction with peers and with managers. And this interaction with manager is very important because it is a known mitigating factor of stress. So in an environment where you have poor job control, high job strains with high intensity and so on, the role of the manager is key, is mitigating this stress. Of course, there are good and bad managers as well. But, and what happens when you remove this interaction with managers through algorithmic management systems is that the workers loses, as you say, the opportunity to put the decisions or the information collected in use in context. And that's where emotions and empathy and understanding maybe why the worker had a day where he or she was less performant plays a big role. And this all impacts on the way workers perceive the system, the organization culture, and whether or not, or how it will impact on their mental health.
I think what you've described is simply bad practice. It's simply bad practice. It's not sustainable. It's a short-termist strategy. It's going to lead to long-term destruction of workplace culture and attendant damage to health and well-being, not only of the individual staff but also groups as well. So I would really,
which ultimately would be counterproductive for the company. Yeah, so
tempting.
Yeah,
it's
fight back.
It's tempting. It's seductive, but it's ultimately, and you hear it. Can I talk a little bit more? Okay, so because you hear these stories of very large companies like Microsoft, Klarna, all those ones regretting firing people and replacing them with AI, and that's because you're losing the kind of talent and you're losing the human aspects of the workplace. It's just bad idea all around, I think.
Yes.
Okay, we have a question in the middle.
Yeah, thank you. Kevin McGillivray. I'm the Data Protection Officer at the Norwegian Tax Administration. I noticed the first two speakers used the term monitoring consistently, and then the third speaker also took in surveillance. When we're looking at all of the tools that were placed in the first slides, everything from monitoring of keystrokes to an overview of all the devices that are being used throughout the day, et cetera. It seems much more like surveillance to me. Could you say something on what the significance is, and if you have any things that you could recommend to stop a further profiling based on that information? And the other point was transparency. Transparency is an important tool, of course, but when the employee really has no ability to consent or have any meaningful opportunity to steer clear of the surveillance or the monitoring that's going on, how is that? How should we approach that in the workplace? Thank you.
I can answer on the first point. Do you want to? Okay, so the first point you mentioned was about conflation of the terms monitoring and surveillance. I wrote a paper on this in 2011. It's a long time ago now, but what I said in that paper was, and it's actually related to what I said in my presentation, I said there's two groups of academics who've researched this. You have the occupational psychologists on the one hand, and you have the work sociologists on the other. The work sociologists use the term surveillance. The occupational psychologists use the term monitoring. They're referring to the same set of practices, but what you're reflecting in the use of the different terms is the actual commitments of the different disciplines that are approaching it. But they actually mean the same thing. Effectively, they refer to the same set of practices, but the sociologists typically concerned with power relations, typically concerned with that kind of thing. Psychologists more concerned with stress, health, well-being, efficiency. So it's a sort of a different term referring to the same thing. For transparency, you rightly refer to a lack of power, but I think this is what we've been saying all the way through, isn't it? About consultation and all that. Well, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues to answer that question if you'd like to.
Well, on this aspect, what I should say is that what we see in terms of transparency, I mean, we are obviously able to capture only in the survey we did, only to the extent that workers are aware that they are digitally monitored. Of course, we have asked workers to say, are you monitored or not? Then if there are other practices that escape what is under workers' control, that obviously we cannot say. I guess there are, but obviously it's more difficult for us to capture that.
And essentially it's down to the efficacy of the management-worker relationship and how well it's put together. We see from the research findings, employees who know about the can control the onset of monitoring and know where the information goes and their rights under policy have a better outcome, and that's due to effective management, responsible management, as informed by the principles of data protection and other things.
Thank you. I'm President of ASSO-DPO, the Association of Data Protection Officer, and it's an interesting panel, but when I look at the focus point, in my opinion, there is one focus point that it's important, literacy for data controller, because many of the data monitoring is under the radar, because the data controller doesn't understand that if I use smart working, if I use some tools, there are the possibility to have the controller of the employee. If I use GPS on the vehicle, I know I'm a data controller and data processor. So the importance of guidelines, European guidelines, because the legislation is too different. I'm a DPO of a multinational company, and I have great difficulty to give a literacy and awareness to the data controller on this issue, and in particular for the use of biometrics, because now if I use a tool for data for meeting online, there is the possibility to use the biometrics of my voice, my image, but I have not the possibility to use a particular, in particular, the possibility GDPR cannot use, I have not the possibility to use consent because there is an employee. And so this is a real situation. It is a patchwork for us. Thank you.
Yes, no, absolutely. Sorry, can you hear me? Does it work? So, absolutely. So the data controller, there is a lack of awareness, and we see this in the UK as well. And as I said earlier, they keep banging on about consent when it's not valid. But the only thing that I can suggest is that for regulators, for the commissioner, to keep regulating, because the message needs to come across, and with a sort of fine enforcement. I know it's the stick rather than the carrot, I get it, but unfortunately that's how some organization will learn. We've had situation in the UK where a very renowned sort of Swedish furniture company put CCTV cameras in the toilets, okay? So it's invasive, but it was because the employee knew their rights, and so then they fought back. There was another scenario where another organization, they put fingerprints for locking in and locking out at the gyms for their employees. They got enforcement notice from our ICO, from the UK commissioner. So it's only through these stories that are going to go live in the media that there is that awareness that's going to come through. Case laws, things, people like us, like data protection professional, we keep going on and on. We write articles, we do webinars, free webinars, we do podcasts to increase that knowledge and awareness. So, I love to talk to you more in details on how we can, tackle it in a much wider way, because it is a real concern and it is across the board.
Hi, thank you. I'm a lawyer in private practice. I'm also a TPO. This is a question for the researchers or looking at research. It seems that the focus is the effect of monitoring on employees. If you look at it from a data protection perspective, there are activities which are monitoring of employees, monitoring to check if they comply with policies, if they comply with hours, etc. But there are other activities which the purpose from a data protection perspective is not monitoring of employees. So GPS in trucks to track deliveries, but could have an effect on the privacy of employees. My question, really curiosity, is if the research or in research project that you are aware of, if this distinction is relevant or considered.
Yes.
Yes, it is. I mean, I didn't have the time to enter in detail. Of course, what we gather is a set of, I think, 16 working conditions indicators that go from autonomy, stress, place of work, time of work, etc., etc. Now, obviously, theoretically, we could propose some causal link, even though we are not able to test that, but some causal link from, for example, the use of some technologies and augmented stress and reduced autonomy or more autonomy at the workplace. In other cases, the direction of causality is not that clear because the case you made is exactly this. I mean, we don't know. I mean, it makes more sense that a certain technology is used because of the type of work that people do. And that's the case of bus driver, for example, the case of delivery trucks, etc. It's not that because you are using some digital devices that you are being monitored and you are tracked. It's the other way around. It's because you're doing this and that the employers need basically to track you. So in this sense, yes, we do differentiate these different aspects. The direction of causality, in some cases, I think it's clearer than others, what drives what. But yes, we do try to consider that as far as we could, of course.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, on one of my complicated slides where I showed the results of the survey of establishment, maybe you haven't paid attention, but the use, and I didn't mention it because I didn't have time, but the use of monitoring technologies for OSH purposes, so to monitor and protect workers' well-being, so monitor noise level, monitor body temperature in case of firefighter or heart rate variability, etc. That was the only case where the reporting of psychosocial risks was lower in the case of the presence of technology. So I have to say these findings are from 2024. The previous survey that we ran in 2019, we didn't see that pattern. So it was exactly the same, higher prevalence of psychosocial risk in the case of such technologies like for the others. This year, we're starting some follow-up interviews to the survey, so we will go back to some establishments to better understand the answer. So we are looking at that and we're trying to understand better. But this falls back also a bit to the question on the literacy. What we've seen as well is that I call them employers, or managers, or data controller, or that they are not always aware of what they are able to do with the data that is being monitored. And they are even sometimes overwhelmed because they get so many data, they don't even know how to use it properly for the objective that they had set. And we've even talked into the case of an employer working with a technology developer where they were wanting to develop some monitoring systems to prevent musculoskeletal disorders. So they were monitoring ergonomics postures of workers. And the researchers found out that with what they were monitoring, they were able to predict potential development of Alzheimer later in the life of the worker. So they stopped the project because they felt overwhelmed. And that's one of the barriers to the implementation of monitoring technologies. In fact, I think it's in the survey from the OECD where the lack of understanding of being outlaw, let's say, with the monitoring of this data. So this fear from employer side is one of the barriers for not monitoring even more in workplaces. So roughly said. Yeah.
Okay, we still have a bit of time for any more questions.
Hi, thank you so much. Jacob from the Netherlands, attorney there, and I have several clients. In the Netherlands, there's not much monitoring allowed, which we also saw in the statistics. And what I'm wondering, and it touches upon the previous question, is I have many clients in retail which have many younger employees which stay there for only a short time, which results in a quite a high risk of things like theft or other criminal aspects done by the employers, but also just in general done by customers of the retail. And I'm wondering if this difference if you see any difference in your research when CCTV primarily is used to determine potential criminal activities.
We don't, in the sense, the way we formulated the question is about monitoring the work of people. Now, obviously, there are some cases like banks where CCTVs work both ways. They monitor, they might monitor the work of the people, but as well have a prevention function. What we found is interesting about CCTVs is that among the indicators that we gather, it's the one that has the most negative effect, or at least correlation, with working conditions in terms of autonomy, etc. Which I think it's interesting because that to us is like, okay, the mere fact that you know that you're being monitored serves as an element of control on the workers. It's not about receiving orders. It's not about having a tool, a device that tells you to work faster or that increases your work rhythm, etc. But perhaps there is a more psychological element there that is the only thing, the mere fact that I know that I'm in control, then this has an effect on my working conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, the specific case you refer to is actually not that well researched. So use of CCTV in retail settings to prevent theft. But when you look at the way that the guidance is articulated in the UK, you'll see that there are three main purposes for legitimate monitoring in the workplace. One is for liability and compliance. The other is to monitor resource use. Third is to protect commercial interests. So, mitigating against employee theft is a legitimate purpose. But again, it all comes down to how it's done. It all comes down to how that's managed in practice. And how proportionate the techniques are compared to the problem itself. But yes, high turnover and low commitment. It's a classic melting pot for quite exacting employee surveillance, and retail is really one of the main industries where we see that. So.
Yeah. And I think fairness is also a key element to any type of monitoring. It's not just the transparency, but the fairness needs to be there as well. Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Okay.
Hello, I'm Ajanta. I am a privacy lawyer. I work in a tech company in Norway. In Norway, it's also not really allowed to have a lot of monitoring practices, and you really need to meet high threshold to qualify for monitoring. So I'm not very aware of the practices as it goes in the other countries. So I was wondering, are there any specific workplace monitoring practices that are categorically prohibited, or like blanket prohibitions exist, or is it more like more principle based, in the sense that where any practice could potentially be justified as long as conditions like proportionality, transparency, and legitimate purpose are met, as we just discussed? Any red flags, any sort of use cases where we need more guardrails or we need to be more careful of? I just wanted to, yeah. Thank you.
So in the UK, it's principally led in terms of there isn't anything, so you can't, like you go in Norway where you say it's limited. So it's very much proving the purpose, proving the fairness, the transparency, and using, that's why the ICO has issued a guideline, the UK regulators issued a guideline for that. But I do believe that in other countries within Europe there are more stringent guidelines and more stringent rules. But in the UK, not so much.
Specific prohibition in Germany, private conversation monitoring and also biometrics in the workplace. I know that much. I think I'm not a lawyer. That's my belief.
I'm not a lawyer either. Maybe I shouldn't step into that area, but the EU AI Act classifies different systems and purposes. There are some that are prohibited, like monitoring emotions in the workplace, for instance. However, it's not that straightforward, because if it can be demonstrated that it's for safety purposes, then it can be done. The requirements are not that stringent. So it's really borderline. If you monitor the emotions, for instance, of a truck driver to detect tiredness with the purpose of, maybe planning breaks, etc. How much are we going into safety purposes? There are other pieces of regulation maybe for that, with every 2 hour, compulsory break, or so it's very borderline in some aspects.
Yeah, very interesting question. Thank you.
And there are other high risk systems like those used in the workplace to monitor and make decision having an impact on contractual relationships, like appraisal, termination of contractual relationships, etc. So the AI Act defines some specific requirement for these systems.
Okay, I'm going to have the final word because we're out of time. I wanted to thank our panelists for sticking to time, fielding all the questions posed to them, and also for presenting a series of presentations that flowed very naturally from one to the other. So it's been a really good panel. I wanted to thank you all for coming along this morning and for contributing to a really interesting discussion. So I think it's I've done lots of panels in CPDP over the years, and I think this one's worked really well. So I'd like to just finish before I let you go and have coffee and lunch, whatever's next on your program. Can we just thank our speakers in the usual way, and maybe we'll see you next year at the CRIS panel. Thank you.